They did not know they were standing at the edge of history. They only knew the bridge would not hold. The timbers beneath their feet were trembling, not from age, but from impact. Shields crashing, boots pounding up the low thunder of men advancing with a dark and singular purpose. Behind them, axes bit into wood. In front of them, an army. Rome was young then. Not the Rome of marble and empire, not the Rome of triumphal arches and legions cutting across continents. Before the marble there was mud. This Rome was timber pressed into damp earth. It was a place of smoke that clung to your clothes and the heavy, persistent smell of livestock kept too close to home. Wealth was not measured in coin, but in cattle, picus, and trade was the dull thud of raw bronze, the aes rude, hitting a wooden scale. It was a settlement of grit, clinging to a cluster of hills beside a restless river, trying not to disappear into the fog of history. And it was about to be tested. The king had been driven out. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, remembered as Tarquin the Proud. His fall had not brought peace. It had brought uncertainty. Power had shifted, but it had not settled. Exile breeds resentment, and resentment gathers allies. From the north came the Etruscans under the authority of Lars Porsena of Clusium. Their objective was simple: restore the old order, reclaim influence. Remind this small, defiant city that kings do not fall without consequence. If they crossed the river, Rome would fall. There were no vast stone walls yet worthy of legend, no hardened imperial legions, only citizen soldiers, farmers and craftsmen, gripping shields with hands more familiar with plows and tools. Between the army and the city stood a wooden structure, the Pons Sublicius. Functional, essential, exposed. According to the sacred traditions of the pontiffs, no iron nails held this bridge together. It was a masterpiece of timber and tension, built to be dismantled as quickly as it was assembled. Today it would have to be destroyed, but destruction takes time. And time must be bought with blood. According to Roman tradition, 3 men stepped forward to hold the narrow crossing, while others worked behind them to cut the supports. Their names were preserved because Rome chose to remember them: Spurius Latius, Titus Herminius, and Publius Horatius, later called Cocles the One-Eyed, 3 men against an advancing force that turned the horizon grey with bronze and spears. It is tempting to imagine speeches, bold declarations cast dramatically across the river. Later, historians would provide such words, but in the moment itself, there would have been little room for rhetoric. Breath was too precious. The smell of sweat, wet wood, and oxidized metal filled the air. The bridge narrowed the enemy's numbers. Only a few could advance at once. That was the advantage. The only one. The first clashes were sudden and violent. Spears thrust into the gaps of shields. Wood splintered under the weight of the charge. Bodies were shoved dangerously close to the edge where the yellow waters of the Tiber churned below. Behind the defenders, Roman laborers hacked at the beams with urgency. Wood cracked, fibers strained. The structure shuddered with every blow of the axe. The Etruscans pressed harder. They expected resistance, but not this. Time stretched in fragments. A heartbeat, a lunge, a retreat. Another surge forward. The Roman shield, heavy and faced with hide, grew heavier with every strike it absorbed. At some point, the order came for 2 of the defenders to withdraw. The bridge was nearly compromised. It would not stand much longer. Reluctantly, Latius and Herminius fell back toward the city, their boots echoing on the failing planks. Horatius remained, alone now at the narrowing throat of timber. Later writers would shape him into something almost mythic, a figure of defiance, a man who mocked the enemy for their numbers. Perhaps he did. Perhaps he said nothing at all. Perhaps the only sound was his own ragged breathing and the splintering of the wood behind him. What matters is that he did not move. He held the line long enough. The beams gave way. With a sound like splitting thunder, the bridge collapsed into the Tiber. Timber and rope vanished into a mountain of spray. The pathway into Rome dissolved in seconds. Horatius stood for one last moment at the edge of emptiness, a lone silhouette against the Etruscan host. Then he turned and jumped. The Tiber is no calm stream. It is a restless, pulling force that drags at armor and seizes at limbs. It swallows debris and men alike without distinction. For a long, silent moment, he disappeared beneath the surface. On the far bank, Romans watched in a silence so deep it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Had he misjudged the current? Had the weight of his bronze gear dragged him into the silt? Then, movement. A head breaking water, arms cutting through the current, slow, stubborn strokes towards safety. Against every expectation, he reached the shore. Rome still stood. The Etruscan advance stalled. Denied their crossing, they withdrew to regroup, their momentum broken by the courage of a single man. The city had gained time, and time in war is often the difference between survival and extinction. Whether every detail unfolded precisely as tradition records is impossible to know. Our primary account comes centuries later, preserved in the writings of Livy. Memory and meaning tend to blend over time. But the Romans did not preserve this story merely for spectacle. They preserved it because it captured a turning point in their political identity. Rome had expelled its king. That alone was radical. In a world where monarchy was the norm, the idea that power could be distributed among magistrates, overseen by a senate, and anchored, however imperfectly, in citizen participation was dangerous and fragile. The Republic was not yet stable. It was not equal. It was not free in the modern sense, but it was different. Authority no longer rested in a single crown, and that difference had to be defended. Horatius was not fighting for a monarch's pride. He was buying time for a city experimenting with shared rule, a political gamble made of wood and willpower. The early Republic would struggle. Internal tensions between patricians and plebeians would erupt, offices would be contested, rights demanded, compromises forged and broken. Rome would not glide smoothly toward greatness. It would stumble, often violently. But something fundamental had shifted in that early crisis. The survival of the state no longer depended on the survival of a king. It depended on its citizens. The symbolism of the collapsing bridge is difficult to ignore. It was an act of destruction intended to preserve something larger, a severing of immediate access in order to protect long-term autonomy. Rome chose to cut the path back to monarchy, even at enormous risk. History rarely announces its revolutions in grand declarations. More often it begins in moments of pressure, in decisions made quickly under threat by people who cannot see the long arc of consequence. On that day, there was no certainty of empire, no prophecy of dominance across the Mediterranean. There was mud, fear, the sound of axes biting into wood, and a single figure standing longer than he had any reason to. From such raw beginnings would grow institutions that shaped continents, elected magistrates, codified laws. The idea, imperfect and contested, that the state belonged not to one man, but to a body of citizens. Centuries later, the Republic itself would fracture under ambition and civil war, but even then, the language of the Republic endured. Senate, citizen, law, duty, concepts born in fragility. The river flowed on, indifferent. The broken timber drifted downstream and disappeared into the salt of the sea. Rome remained, still small, still uncertain, but changed. The bridge had fallen. The city had refused. And in that refusal lay the beginning of something that would, over time, alter the structure of power in the ancient world. Not immediately, not cleanly, but irreversibly. They thought they were defending a crossing, and in truth, they were defending an idea. And ideas, once tested in crisis and found strong enough to survive, do not vanish easily. Wood rots, kings fall. Empires rise and fracture. But the belief that a people might govern themselves, that power might be shared, debated, and restrained, that belief has a way of reshaping the world. On the banks of the Tiber, in smoke and splintered timber, that belief took one of its first decisive breaths. The bridge collapsed. And something entirely new began. I am the Chronicle Seeker. If you want to see the past rebuilt, stone by stone and bone by bone, join the search. What chapter of history shall we unlock next?